الله بالخير. ما يحدث في البحار ليس صدفة ولا خطأ تكتيكيا ولا حادثا معزولا. ناقلات تصادر، سفن تجارية تستهدف، وضربات تنفذ حيث لا حرب معلنة. النفط لم يعد تجارة بات سلاحا، والبحر لم يعد طريقا بل ساحة صدام. حين تحتجز ناقلة صينية لا تخضع للعقوبات فالمستهدف ليس فنزويلا، وحين تضرب ناقلة روسية على بعد 2000 كيلومتر من أوكرانيا فالمقصود ليس كييف، المقصود هو إعادة تعريف من يملك البحر ومن يملك التجارة ومن يملك حق استخدام القوة من دون مساءلة. واشنطن تقول بحسب استراتيجية الأمن الوطنية 2025 إن الصين مجرد منافس اقتصادي، لكنها تتصرف معها كعدو استراتيجي، تضيق على طاقتها، تحاصر استثماراتها، وتسلح تايوان بأسلحة هجومية بعيدة المدى لا للدفاع بل لتغيير قواعد الاشتباك. الأخطر من ذلك أن هذه السياسة تدار في ظل انقسام خطير داخل الدولة الأمريكية نفسها، والتصعيد يمضي من دون كوابح أو خطوط حمر. من الذي يصدر أوامر هذه الأفعال التي تعد في القانون الدولي أعمال حرب؟ ومن يقرر، الرئيس أم الدولة العميقة أم حلفاء واشنطن؟ إذا كانت الصين منافسا اقتصاديا فقط فلماذا يستهدف شريان طاقتها في عرض البحار؟ وهل ما تشهده من مصادرة الناقلات والضربات بالمسيرات ونقل السلاح هو حوادث متفرقة أم الطور الأول من مواجهة متعددة الجبهات لم يجرؤ أحد بعد على تسميتها؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر مع مايكل فلاهوس، المؤرخ الأمريكي المتخصص في الحرب والاستراتيجية والهوية في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين، وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. Salam and welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is Zeinab Al Saffar for the Proximate Aspect, and my dear guest, Michael Vlahos, American historian of war and strategy and identity politics. Michael, it's absolutely splendid to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Most welcome. Well, I have a lot of issues to learn about. Allow me to start by asking, well, the American project after 9/11 took on a de facto imperial character, with the US presidency transformed into an imperial office, as you say, built on promises of permanent victory. Today, Michael, does President Trump's MO after 1 year in office reflect this, especially in the wake of the US strategic doctrine or the NSS document?
I think the document, which is not so much as it is billed a strategy, but rather a sort of visionary statement of a path forward for the nation, or if you will, the empire. And it is a watershed document in the sense that it implicitly and somewhat subtly redefines the way ahead for the United States, away from the more aggressive global politics that the United States, I think, recklessly pursued after 2001, and moving toward a more ceremonial presentation of power. In other words, and this is consonant with Mr. Trump's character. He's very much a showman or ceremonially inclined person. He seems to operate best in ritual occasions, right? Where meetings, speeches, and the symbolic demonstration of power rather than the actual use of what is known as main force, which is what earlier presidents were engaged in. They were basically war presidents, and they exercised power as force, as what the Greeks would call dynamis. You know, it was all physical, material applications of force. And even the small use of force that Mr. Trump has used in Iran was extremely ritualized. It was more like an act of theater than it was any kind of real military operation.
Right.
And that is very much the kind of approach that he takes. And I believe, although no one can really say for sure what he thinks, but I do believe that he understands that the United States is no longer in the unipolar moment. That moment passed in historical terms very quickly. It was like an instant in history, 30 years. And he realizes that the world is a different place, and that the United States has not the physical power any longer to enforce its will. And in fact, the effort to enforce its will, for example, most famously in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine through the proxy war against Russia, those have failed. In fact, the U.S. application of power failed more than a half century ago in Vietnam. And the U.S. has taken a very long time to realize that the symbolic instruments of power do not necessarily translate equally into military success. In fact,
did it fail in West Asia? Is it failing in West Asia?
Oh, you mean in what the British used to call the Near and Middle East?
Yeah, the Middle East,
Well,
yes.
the U.S. has supported what may end up being a fatal Israeli attack, a fatal campaign on the part of Israel to achieve its most deeply held goals, which the United States has supported to its great discredit. And the war that Israel has unleashed on not just Gaza, but also on southern Lebanon and Hezbollah is a failing enterprise, and it will not succeed over historical time, although as long as the U.S. supports Israel, it will continue. But the United States has pursued not simply a reckless strategy in West Asia, but a strategy without focus and without any sort of identifiable goal. The U.S. military-industrial complex loves to talk about goals and objectives, but it failed to identify even one objective that came even a millimeter toward achievement.
Right.
I mean, the goal in Iraq was absurd. The goal in Libya was a fantasy. In Somalia, Yemen, Syria, on and on. The U.S. has unleashed
Absolutely.
power
Yes.
without any hope of achieving anything.
Allow me to ask you, Michael, here, was Trump's anti-war posture genuine, or did it simply outsource U.S. wars in West Asia to the deep state, to intelligence networks, and its regional proxies, as you said?
Well, this is the eternal imperial problem that is often missed, not just by casual readers of history, but historians themselves, and that is namely that empire is not simply about what the empire does to others and how they change others, but the empire is also about the deep internal changes that occur. And you just identified the key change, which is also the key vulnerability of empire, which is the creation of a bureaucracy of power. The deep state is a wonderfully resonant metaphor to use, but really we're talking about a society that wields power, and everything in that society is about how power is wielded and how it is
Exactly.
displayed.
That's my question, Michael. Today, which center of power is driving operational decisions? The president, the security bureaucracy, or the deep state, or allied pressure networks?
Well, you've identified another weakness, which is that empires are always coalitions. It's never absolute administrative rule. And the allies, who are effectively client states, tributaries, and vassals, are always creating problems. And so the U.S. is saddled with a congery, a gaggle of European states as well as Israel, who are constantly demanding that the U.S. not only pay attention to them, but give them everything they want and do everything possible to help them achieve what they want. And that's simply not possible. So here you have a president, an emperor, as I see him in an imperial system, is constantly beset by having to deal with these fractious vassals, as well as a entrenched bureaucracy that lives only for the exercise of its power, because only in the exercise of its power can it wield the true currency of power, which is status. And the bureaucracy in Washington, in the imperial city, as I call it, is all about status. And status can be achieved and secured only through war. And so it is a very self-destructive dynamic. And this is the problem of empires. It's not simply that empires overreach. It is that they are at their very soul, as it were, structurally configured
Yes.
to
Allow me,
overreach.
please.
They have to overreach.
Sure. Now, after Netanyahu's recent visit to Trump, is the U.S. president lured into war with Iran based on Netanyahu's reframing Iran as an urgent missile threat, not just a nuclear one? Is Iran, Michael, being positioned as the trigger event for a regional reset?
I can't imagine, no matter what he may say for public consumption, and especially for donor consumption, shall we say, politically, the last thing that the president should want to do is get sucked into a war with Iran. And in fact, most of, I think, the Arab regimes in the region understand that the Iranian threat is gone now. It has essentially diminished in the eyes of the Arab regimes. They see the threat now as emanating from Turkey. And this is something that is not yet entered into our awareness. But the truth of the matter is that Iran should not really be on America's horizon at all. It is not a threat in any way. And it is the only thing the U.S. can do by maintaining this situation of titular enmity with Iran, the only thing the U.S. can do is drive Iran further into the arms of China and Russia. And also, India is watching and is not really very pleased, I think, with the U.S. approach. So the U.S. is in a position where the last thing it should do is seek out hostility with Iran. And
Right.
the U.S. is
But,
doing
but
so only because of Israel. We all know this.
Sure, but allow me here to ask you, is U.S. intervention in West Asia driven by security interest or by the need to constantly reaffirm American identity through permanent war? If presidents come and go, but wars
Right.
in West Asia persist, who actually sets the U.S. strategy? The elected leaders or an unelected security consensus?
Well, the unelected security consensus has it's a consensus with a nexus. In other words, you have the deep state, which of course desires to fulfill its destiny, but you also have the Israeli connection, and much of what the U.S. has done in West Asia has been driven by Israel, and it has come close to destroying America's position in the world, because none of the conflicts that the U.S. has pursued in that region have any value to American security. Now, back in the 70s, at the time of, again, another war between Arab states and Israel in 73 led to an oil embargo, and then there was great fear that Europe would be hamstrung by an oil blockade, and that all seemed to make sense in the larger context of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, but that is decades past now. There's no reason, and the dominant Arabian players, the Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, they're no longer looking at Iran the way they did 20 or 30 years ago. And frankly, given what Turkey has been doing in Syria and its aggressive attitude generally in the Eastern Mediterranean, is more of a concern. And you see a shift going on.
A concern to the U.S. or a concern to Israel?
Well, I think, Israel is, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the British poet, said, an albatross around our neck.
Sure.
And that has to be dealt with. And unfortunately, the what I call the nexus between the deep state and the Israeli lobby, which is a lobby of American Zionists primarily, is a burden on the United States. I think Mr. Trump knows this, and yet he is inextricably tied to it. So it's a tremendous problem. And if I could use a historical analogy, the U.S. has an emperor system, but it's very much like the Roman imperial system in Constantinople in the 11th century, where you had a bureaucracy very much like the American deep state, and the emperors would come and go and had no capacity to stop things, to rein things in, and it led to a near collapse of the Roman Empire.
Right.
And I think the U.S. is in something like that position right now.
But today, Michael, is maritime coercion becoming Washington's new substitute for direct war? I mean, by seizing tankers and tolerating long-range strikes on commercial shipping, is the U.S. deliberately normalizing economic warfare at sea as a way to confront China, Russia, and Iran? And if so, how long before this triggers symmetric retaliation, mirroring these actions in the South China Sea, for example, and Arctic routes? Briefly, if I may.
There are several different theaters of action here. The South China Sea is very different from, say, the Caribbean. And the Caribbean and the action there in terms of seizing tankers is bound up in an extravagant bit of theater to serve as a kind of strategic misdirection, to draw attention away from the former American commitment to destroying Russia to a new kind of activity that asserts American hegemony or dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think this is all a kind of, it's a kind of magic trick.
Yeah, but what's your prognosis in this sense? With multiple theaters activating simultaneously, is there still any functioning mechanism to prevent a cascade conflict? Or do you see a sort of a black swan event that could trigger the current status quo?
Well, there's always room for a black swan, of course. But my sense is that world, I wouldn't call it stability, but a world that does not slide in easily into global conflict is kept safe, if you will, not by any kind of international mechanism which is regulating or deterring bad actors. I think it is actually a consensus among the true great powers, which are the United States, China, and Russia at this point. And you can perhaps add India, maybe Japan, maybe Brazil. But I mean, a small group of great powers do not want to go to war because they understand the deep fragility of the world that they have authority over. In other words, the world they rule, whether it's Russia, China, the United States, India, a war would bring everything down for them.
Sure.
And they have the great example of World War I, where you had powers that knew that they were fragile, and that's especially true of the Ottoman Porte and the Russian Empire, and even Germany, and certainly Austria-Hungary. But they went to war anyway. What happened? All of those places collapsed.
Sure.
And that is a very powerful lesson.
Well,
China.
Yes, Michael.
Now, the nature of world trade and the nature of the world economy, it really prohibits taking in the enormous risk that would come with a world war.
Right. Well, we have to leave it there. Michael Vlahos, American historian of war, strategy, and identity politics. We truly appreciate, Michael, your insights and your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again after all these years.
Always a pleasure. لعل عقيدة مونرو هي بيان جوهري في السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية أعلنه الرئيس جيمس مونرو عام 1823. خلاصتها المطلقة: نصف الكرة الغربي مغلق أمام أي استعمار أوروبي جديد أو تدخل. تاريخيا ولدت العقيدة لتحمي دول أمريكا اللاتينية الفتية آنذاك من القوى الأوروبية، لكنها مع الزمن تحولت إلى ذريعة لتبرير التدخل الأمريكي وإرساء الهيمنة الأمريكية، غالبا ما تسمى السيطرة الإمبريالية على تلك المنطقة الجغرافية. هذا التفسير الأخير هو ما يشير إليه تحليل خطة ترامب أو استراتيجية الأمن القومي على أنه إحياء لعقيدة مونرو. الآن تخطط الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لهيمنة مصممة لنزاع نهائي وحاسم. إنها تبني حصنا لتحاصر العالم عبر خطة لسيادة دائمة تحققها عبر التفريق والتحكم والاستئثار. يبقى السؤال الملح: عندما تنجح الولايات المتحدة في تحقيق هيمنتها المحصنة المثالية وبناء إمبراطورية بتحويل جيرانها إلى أتباع، من سيدافع عن القلعة؟ السادة أم المستعبدون؟ من كل الميادين، حياكم.